In 1941, the entire future of North America's tallest bird hung by a thread. Just 15 whooping cranes remained, their numbers shredded from tens of thousands by hunting, feathery fashion, and disappearing wetlands. 80 years on, the species is still here, but at a fragile fraction of its former glory. This is the story of how a handful of survivors triggered the most audacious rescue in conservation history, and why their survival demanded far more than anyone expected. How did everything go so wrong so quickly? And what did it take to even begin turning back extinction? Before the collapse, whooping cranes swept across the continent in flocks numbering between 15,000 and 20,000. These birds towered over prairie grasses, standing 5 feet tall, with wings that stretched 7.5 feet from tip to tip. Their range once spanned from the Rocky Mountains to the Atlantic, from the Canadian tundra down to the Gulf Coast. But even in abundance, whooping cranes were never prolific. Their biology set strict limits on how quickly they could rebound from any loss. Each pair bonded for life, performing elaborate courtship dances each spring. From 2 eggs laid in a nest, only 1 chick was usually raised to fledging. The other egg, often left unhatched or abandoned, reflected a strategy shaped by centuries of hard lessons. Better to invest in one strong offspring than risk both to hunger or predators. Growing up was slow. A whooping crane did not reach breeding age until nearly 7 years old. Their lifespans, stretching 22 to 30 years in the wild, offered some insurance against bad seasons or calamity, but also meant that generations turned over at a glacial pace. Even under perfect conditions, it would take decades for their numbers to recover from a sharp decline. The crane's fate was tied to the fate of wetlands and marshes. As a wetland indicator, their presence signaled the health of entire ecosystems. But their slow, careful approach to life, 1 chick at a time, late maturity, and strong site fidelity, left them uniquely vulnerable when the world began to change around them. The very traits that allowed them to thrive for millennia would become obstacles in a century shaped by human speed and appetite. Demand for whooping crane feathers once drove a booming market. Women's fashion in the late 1800s prized their bright white plumes, fueling a trade paid by the ounce and leaving marshes littered with bodies. Hunters, both commercial and subsistence, shot cranes for meat as well as profit. In cities like New Orleans and Chicago, roasted crane appeared on restaurant menus, while milliners in New York and London turned wings and crests into high-priced hats. Rare eggs fetched premiums among collectors, some traveling thousands of miles to raid nests and add whooping crane shells to private cabinets and museum displays. No law or custom limited the harvest. The true engine of collapse, however, churned beneath the soil. As settlers spread across the continent, prairie wetlands were drained at an astonishing pace, first by hand-dug ditches, then by steam-powered pumps. By the turn of the 20th century, 60 to 90% of the region's marshes and potholes had vanished, replaced by wheat, corn, and cattle pasture. Each lost acre erased the feeding and nesting grounds that cranes depended on. Oil and gas exploration followed, carving canals and laying pipelines through what little habitat remained. Intercoastal waterways and levees fragmented migration corridors, forcing birds into smaller, more exposed pockets of land. The scale of destruction was measured not just in lost birds, but in the erasure of entire ecosystems. With every market shipment and every acre drained, whooping cranes lost the foundation of their survival. By 1860, only about 1,400 birds remained, a fraction of their former numbers. In the decades that followed, the population continued its freefall, driven as much by the relentless march of industry as by the gun and the collector's net. The world that had shaped the crane's slow, careful life was being dismantled at a speed no species could withstand. By the early 1940s, every remaining whooping crane depended on a handful of protected places. The creation of Aransas National Wildlife Refuge in Texas and Wood Buffalo National Park in Canada offered the last wild flock a fragile sanctuary, one stretch of marsh in the south and a sweep of boreal wetland in the north. in the north. These reserves, carved out of a shrinking world, were meant to shield cranes from the worst of human impact. Laws followed. The Migratory Bird Treaty Act promised federal protection, and later the Endangered Species Act listed the whooping crane as threatened in 1967 and as endangered in 1970. On paper, the species was now among the most protected birds in North America. Yet the numbers told a different story. From a low of just 15 birds in 1941, the population inched up over the next 3 decades. By 1970, after nearly 30 years of refuge management, anti-poaching patrols, and legal safeguards, there were only 57 whooping cranes alive. The math was relentless. Even with every egg guarded and every marsh patrolled, the flock's slow reproduction and vulnerability to disaster meant recovery barely kept pace with loss. One bad storm or outbreak could undo years of careful stewardship. Public attention grew as the crisis deepened. In February 1956, ornithologist Robert Porter Allen appeared on the CBS television show To Tell the Truth, urging millions of viewers to act before it was too late. Letters, donations, and phone calls poured in. Congressional funding expanded the Aransas Refuge, and the whooping crane became a national symbol of vanishing wildlife. Still, the climb was painfully slow. By 2005, the wild population reached 214. 5 years later, 2010, it was 383. The species survived, but only just. Fragile, famous, and still hovering on the edge. Protection alone could not solve the deeper problem. A new approach would be needed if the cranes were ever to move beyond survival. At Patuxent Wildlife Research Center in Maryland, a handful of biologists set out to rewrite the fate of a species. Their approach was radical for its time. Rather than relying on the slow, uncertain growth of the wild flock, they would breed whooping cranes in captivity using every tool modern science could offer. The program's foundation rested on a simple but powerful insight. In the wild, a whooping crane pair usually hatched 2 eggs, but almost never raised both chicks. One was left to fate, often abandoned or lost to predators. At Patuxent, biologists collected these second eggs, incubating them under controlled conditions. Each rescued egg became a hedge against extinction, doubling the chance that precious genes would survive another generation. The turning point arrived in 1964 when word reached Patuxent of a young crane grounded in northern Canada with a shattered wing. The bird, later named Canis, was flown south for surgery. His injury left him flightless, but not useless. Canis became the backbone of the captive breeding program, his genes now woven through nearly every whooping crane alive today. Patuxent's veterinary team pioneered artificial insemination, a technique then in its infancy. With Canis unable to mate naturally, his semen was collected and used to fertilize eggs from healthy females. The process was painstaking, requiring precise timing and constant monitoring, but it worked. Chicks hatched from Canis's lines soon filled the center's pens, and eventually captive facilities across the continent. Patuxent's staff faced daily challenges that went far beyond the laboratory. Chicks had to be raised without imprinting on humans, so caretakers wore crane costumes and mimicked adult calls. Every detail mattered: diet, temperature, social interactions, all fine-tuned through years of trial and error. Disease outbreaks, genetic bottlenecks, and occasional breeding failures kept the team on edge. Yet by the late 1970s, the center's flock had grown large enough to supply surplus juveniles for release into the wild. International cooperation was key. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the Canadian Wildlife Service coordinated transfers, shared research, and synchronized breeding schedules to maximize genetic diversity. By 1980, Patuxent's captive flock numbered in the dozens, with Canis's descendants making up a substantial portion. Artificial insemination, once a desperate experiment, had become standard practice. The center's success gave conservationists for the first time a way to rebuild not just numbers, but options. Birds could be released, studied, and if necessary, moved between facilities to avoid inbreeding. The captive program did not solve every problem, but it broke the cycle of decline. With a growing population in hand, the next challenge was clear: Could these carefully reared cranes survive in the wild? And could their offspring learn to live as true whooping cranes once more? Bringing whooping cranes back to the wild demanded more than good intentions in safe havens. With a captive flock finally growing, biologists turned to the question of reintroduction, how to rebuild lost populations in places where cranes had vanished for generations. The first major experiment unfolded in Idaho's high country. Starting in 1975, researchers at Grays Lake transferred 289 whooping crane eggs into sandhill crane nests, hoping the foster parents would teach their rare charges to migrate and survive on their own. 85 chicks hatched and followed their sandhill families south each fall, tracing a route across Utah to New Mexico. But when the birds matured, a fundamental problem surfaced. They had imprinted on their foster species. Instead of seeking out other whooping cranes, they courted sandhill cranes, built nests with the wrong partners, and never produced viable offspring. After 14 years and no self-sustaining flock, the Idaho project was abandoned in 1989. The lesson was stark. Species recognition is not optional, it is the foundation for any wild population. Undeterred, conservationists tried a new approach in the wetlands of Central Florida. Beginning in 1993, teams released 286 captive-reared whooping cranes into the Kissimmee Basin, aiming to establish a non-migratory population. The cranes adapted to the landscape and, for a time, showed promise. Some even nested and raised chicks, but high adult mortality and rapid habitat loss undercut every gain. Fewer and fewer juveniles survived to adulthood, and by 2018, only a handful of birds remained. The Florida project was quietly halted, its survivors relocated to join a new effort in Louisiana, where a small number of juveniles, 10 each year, continue to be released at White Lake. The most ambitious experiment began in Wisconsin, where a coalition called the Whooping Crane Eastern Partnership set out to teach migration from scratch. The method was radical: raise chicks in isolation from humans, then lead them south behind ultralight aircraft. At Necedah National Wildlife Refuge, costumed caretakers used crane puppets and recorded calls to prevent human imprinting. Once the birds could fly, pilots in white trikes guided them mile by mile along a 1,200-mile route to Chassahowitzka National Wildlife Refuge on Florida's Gulf Coast. The first successful journey in 2001 was a milestone, but the real breakthrough came in 2006 when a chick hatched and fledged in the wild, the first in the United States in 100 years. Each year, new flocks took to the sky, braving storms and predators, with pilots and ground crews recalibrating after every setback. The ultralight program proved that migration could be taught, not just inherited. Today, roughly 100 cranes in the eastern flock breed and migrate independently, their lives shaped by a blend of instinct and innovation. Every experiment carried its own risks and rewards. The Idaho project failed, but it clarified the importance of species identity. Florida's partial success revealed the limits of habitat and survival in the modern landscape. The ultralight-led Wisconsin-Florida flock, while costly and labor-intensive, stands as a testament to creative problem-solving. Each trial added to the collective knowledge, shaping the ongoing work in Louisiana and beyond. The cranes that fly today do so on paths forged by decades of trial, error, and relentless adaptation. By 2025, the whooping crane population stands at approximately 830 birds, a number that includes every wild and captive crane across North America. The core of this fragile recovery is the Aransas wood buffalo flock, with about 560 individuals migrating each year between the Texas Gulf Coast and the boreal wetlands of northern Canada. These are the only cranes that sustain themselves without direct human intervention, and their survival is closely tracked by teams at both ends of their migration. Outside this main flock, roughly 270 cranes live in managed care at a network of 12 captive breeding centers. The legacy of Patuxent Wildlife Research Center, once the heart of captive breeding, now lives on through these facilities. When Patuxent closed in 2017, 72 cranes, many direct descendants of the foundational bird Canus, were quietly transferred under tight security to organizations like the International Crane Foundation. This transfer ensured that decades of genetic management and breeding expertise would not be lost, but it also signaled a new era of decentralized stewardship. Recovery targets remain ambitious: 40 productive pairs in the Aransas wood buffalo population, and 2 additional groups of 25 pairs each in separate regions. So far, only the main wild flock comes close to meeting its goal. Every year, managers tally nest counts, track migration routes, and monitor stopover sites like Salt Plains National Wildlife Refuge in Oklahoma, where up to 3/4 of the world's cranes rest during their long journey. The rainwater basin in Nebraska, once drained for agriculture, is being restored to provide safe haven during migration. Each of these sites is a linchpin in the species' survival, places where the fate of every bird is measured, counted, and fiercely protected. Every living whooping crane today carries the legacy of a near-vanished flock. Geneticists track the consequences in annual stud book meetings where every pairing is a calculation. 15 founders now stretched across 800 birds. The numbers are stark. With such a narrow base, every generation brings the risk of inherited weakness or lost resilience. DNA samples are shipped between labs, searching for rare alleles that might shield the species from disease or environmental change. So far, no catastrophic inbreeding effects have surfaced. But the margin for error is razor thin, and each year managers debate which birds can safely breed and which must wait. Survival depends on constant human intervention. Captive breeding, artificial insemination, and migration training are routine. In Wisconsin, the eastern flock owes its very sense of direction to pilots and costumed handlers. Some conservationists question whether a crane taught to migrate by ultralight can ever be called wild. Others point to the persistent threats that make wildness a luxury. Illegal shootings still claim birds in Kentucky, Texas, and Oklahoma. Case files fill drawers with evidence and unanswered questions. Power lines, once planned for projects like Keystone XL, remain a lethal hazard, especially near critical stopover wetlands. Disease, like eastern equine encephalitis, sweeps through reintroduced flocks, while predators such as bobcats and golden eagles take a heavy toll on young cranes. The cost of managed survival runs into tens of millions, with each new threat demanding more resources and ingenuity. Indigenous partners now share stewardship, blending traditional knowledge with scientific management, yet even this alliance cannot restore lost genetic diversity. The cranes endure, but their future remains entangled with human responsibility, a fragile balance between rescue and relinquishment. Today, every whooping crane flight across the continent depends on human hands. Decades of vigilance, millions in funding, and habitats under constant threat. This species survives because people refuse to look away, but true independence remains out of reach. As climate change reshapes wetlands and old threats persist, the crane's future still hangs in the balance, a living reminder that saving a species is never a finished task.